Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of topics that matter most to business leaders. In this series, we'll sit down with experts and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we will discuss effective leadership in the face of a recession, which is coming on us here. Amid the complexities of the current economic environment, inflation, confounding labor market, supply chain challenges, and now the projected recession, what should leaders be thinking about? How can businesses prepare and continue to drive growth through this time of uncertainty? Joining me today are Asutosh Padhi, the managing partner for McKinsey Company in North America, and John Kelleher, the senior partner at McKinsey. Asutosh and John, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for having us.
So, Asutosh, maybe you can begin. In your latest paper, you and your McKinsey colleagues forecast an upcoming recession, but you note that there are different potential scenarios. And of course, we know that no two recessions are the same. Maybe you could describe for our listeners the possibilities and how you see this slowdown playing out.
Steve, thank you. And I think let me start by acknowledging what I think you just said, which is if and when we get into a recession, it is going to be unlike anything we have seen in this century, at least. We'll likely need to go back to the 70s and 80s to find good analogs. And why do I say that? We start with the news from last week, which is we did see 2 quarters of negative economic growth. We have seen a significant dip in consumer sentiment. We have seen a dip in business sentiment. And we are seeing inflation running at highs that we've not seen from the 70s and 80s. And as a result of all these factors, I think the question is, a lot of the CEOs asking the question, what really is the macroeconomic viewpoint at this point, and how do they prepare to lead with it? We'll come back to the lead part. But also, before I move off the macroeconomic scenario, let me also point some things that are different than what we would expect to see when we go into a recession. Consumer and corporate cash balances are healthy. If you look at consumer and corporate defaults, they are at historical lows. Equity markets are still holding for the most part. Real estate prices are holding up. Corporate balance sheets, like I said, are still particularly strong. So when we talk to CEOs, I think they're approaching this from the standpoint of strength, and they're talking about growth and productivity, which feels a bit different than what it was in the last 2 recessions that we saw in the US.
Yeah, it is interesting. I began my business career over 40 years ago. I feel like I've lived through, a lifetime worth of recessions, but no two have been the same. And John, in the paper that you all have put together, you've described the current scenarios, and you've said that they are different from the past recessions. Maybe you could describe, how this is different, and how that really makes the CEO's job that much more challenging.
Yeah, I'd love to, and I'll really just expand upon a few things that Asutosh sort of introduced. What's quite unique here is that we're dealing with this phenomena where, coming out of some of the lockdown economic activity through COVID, we actually have an economy that in ways is white hot, right? As Asutosh mentioned, right, we've got incredible a lot of labor and supply chain challenges, and that's really creating, immense issues across the economy. It's very difficult to hire someone for that reason, difficult to manufacture, difficult to move things around from a logistics perspective. So when you look at it through one set of glasses, the economy is just roaring. And then we've got this quite a change in the Fed, where we've gone from a very dovish to a very hawkish environment in a very short period of time, and some pretty major rate increases. And so the economy technically is starting to slow now. As Asutosh mentioned, we've now got 2 quarters of negative growth. And clearly that is beginning to ripple through. But I think part of the reason it doesn't feel like a garden variety recession is because at the same time that we're facing that lower growth, we're experiencing and feeling every day these sort of white hot challenges where the economy doesn't feel like it's slowing. And I think it's part of the reason this feels different, feels unique.
Yeah, I mean, typically what happens in a recession is you get the slowdown, you get the 2 quarters. And so people have this notion that 2 quarters of negative growth or declines makes it a recession. And in fact, that's not necessarily the case. Typically you have an increase in unemployment, you have consumer balance sheets and spending going the wrong way. And that's not the case. And so economists are very concerned about this and a little bit befuddled because we have virtually full employment at the same time you have this slowdown, and people are continuing to spend. They're buying cars, even though the housing market slowed down. So this is really different, and it leaves CEOs a little bit to parse, doesn't it?
It does, Stephen. I think let me use one word in which we're describing the moment in our conversations. I think back to your previous comment. As McKinsey, we're trying to stay away from point forecast. We're not trying to forecast or not forecast a recession. What we're instead looking at is scenarios and what are the factors that could really drive this to a range of possible outcomes. So just last, a couple of weeks ago, we came back and talked about the range of scenario for the United States, for example. And notably, in 2 McKinsey scenarios, growth remains positive or flat over the next several quarters. There is a third and a much more severe scenario, and we consider a significant, more negative possibility that is consistent with last week GDP's report. And I think what we're trying to get to is to say, what are the handful of factors that will likely cause these different scenarios to play out? I think, one thing that's been very clear is the fact that, as we've been talking to CEOs, we almost talk about the weekly pulse of how fast the situation is evolving, right? So just last week, we had information around the Fed interest rates. We had new information around Q2 GDP growth. We had the jobs report and so on. So it is really important. I think this is what we are advising our clients, is to not be predicated on a particular outcome, but to have a range of scenarios and think about how to be able to lead their institutions through those different scenarios.
Yeah, in the Conference Board's latest CEO confidence survey, the CEOs did predict that we were going to have a recession, that it was going to be significant. But the reason that they said that was going to happen is because they thought that the Fed would create it by increasing rates beyond what would create the so-called soft landing. So what should CEOs be thinking about if, in fact, it's a Fed-created recession, and then you start to get the spiral off of that?
So maybe I will look back up. I'll zoom back out for a second. I think this is a moment of great uncertainty. And moments of great uncertainty are when CEOs and institutions can really establish strategic distance relative to the competitors, right? This is what I think our research, the research that John and I and many of our colleagues worked upon really revealed, which is there's a set of companies that we're calling as resilient companies. And what these companies did was they really, as they went through the different parts of the cycle, the macroeconomic cycle, they really use this to be able to differentiate vis-a-vis the peers. Now, I think we define resilience more broadly: financial performance, operational performance, performance related to customers, balance sheet, investments in technology, investments in people. But if I were to take one metric of that, which is total shareholders' returns, for example, what we realized is that typically, if you look at the distribution from a total returns to shareholder standpoint, the delta between the top quintile to the bottom quintile is only about 15 points of TRS. That's what we saw between 2007 and 9. But when we looked at it from 2000, and that started to broaden, that 15 points became 75 basis points from 2009 to 11. And that became 150 basis points from 2011 to 2017. So the institutions that really led differently, and we'll talk more in a second about how that leadership is different, had a 1 to 10 difference relative to the peers. And that's the extent of strategic difference. So no matter what the cause of the macroeconomic uncertainty is, our research is saying that moments of uncertainty are also moments where institutions and CEOs can truly differentiate.
Yeah, this term resilience is an interesting one. You're using it, I think, fairly broadly. I think coming out of the financial crisis, the last big recession, the last recession was the COVID recession, but the last big recession was 2008 and 2009. Liquidity was a key here. And so when I have talked to CEOs, they're thinking back to that time period and liquidity. And if CEOs begin to cut back on hiring, they begin to cut back on CapEx, they begin to hoard cash because of a traditional terminology or traditional use of the term resilience, they could actually create a recession that doesn't have to happen. And I think what you're saying, you're using resilience in a different way. You're saying, rather than just go on defense, if you'll let me use that term, go on offense.
Yeah,
just like that. Yeah.
I love that characterization. I think that's exactly what we're saying, because look, I think one of our biggest messages is that, companies do not come to this challenge, this macroeconomic environment that we're all talking about, in the same place. And it's instructive, I think, to think about different companies. And so we lay out in the article, a number of different archetypes, essentially, and to be very simple about it, right? We've got kind of 4 of them. One is companies that are really well poised to thrive, that go into this uncertainty with enormously high margins. Their trading values are still high. They have no liquidity or distress. And our key message for those companies is go on the offensive. And just to give one example, we think the next 2 years are going to be an amazing time for programmatic M&A, when many, transactions are going to be on sale. And so that's that group. The second group is we call it resolve to reform. So that is companies that are generally well performing, but can do more on costs, that can do more on divestitures, that could take advantage of some M&A and so on. So that's the second group. The third is called fight to survive. This group is already under enormous pressure. A good example here would be some of the consumer and retail names, where there really are distress and some liquidity issues in that sector. And here the key is going to be strengthening the balance sheet, moving quickly on divestitures, moving quickly on cost, in order to create as much strategic, optionality as possible. And then the last group is sort of a unique one, but this is very important, I think. We call it pivot to profit. And for that, just recall about 6 months ago when rates started ticking up, we had a real sell-off in the tech sector in particular, where there was effectively a re-rating, where people wanted to see more current yield and cash flow versus these long-dated cash flows. And so those companies are going to have to do more to pivot from this hyper growth mode where profit didn't matter, more to a situation where they show profit in current accounting periods.
We're talking with Asutosh Padhi and John Kelleher from McKinsey about the current economic state, the upcoming recession, and what businesses should do about it. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of our conversation.
As you and your company monitor the latest wave of shocks that have battered the U.S. economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board now predicts a U.S. recession by the end of 2022. This recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation rate in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, the Conference Board continues its long-standing tradition of providing timely and relevant content on a daily basis to help guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges ahead. Chart a course for the future, which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side by visiting our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Asutosh Padhi and John Kelleher from McKinsey. And Asutosh and John, you both have been part of developing this new paper, this new recommendation for business leaders as they consider the current state of the economy, the global state of the economy, not just the U.S., and how they should act. You know, you've talked about these 6 dimensions of resilience, which is what we were talking about just before the break, and those are different than some of the past recessions, particularly for those companies that are well positioned and have, as you say, the financial strength. What are some of the other differences?
I think, Steve, let me start by saying, I think you touched upon the definition of resilience. And the way I think I'd go back to your previous comment, we define resilience as things that are more timeless and through cycle. It is not just a slash and burn. We think about it relative to financial, operational, digital and technology, brand reputation and ESG, business model, and organization and talent, right? So those are the 6 dimensions. And on each of these, we ask the question, is your organization able to stand, and how effectively can it do no matter what the scenarios are? No matter what the economic scenarios are, how do you position your institution to drive real differentiation? What we have seen is the companies that are what we are calling, what John and I and our team would call as resilient, they actually demonstrated a few characteristics. They led differently, they did different things. And what we realized is, one, they were faster on productivity, meaning they went after productivity harder, but they preserved the capacity for growth. This is important. When they went after productivity, they did not take away the organizational capacity to continue to drive growth, whether it is new customers, whether it's new products, whether it's new innovation. So we saw a difference in productivity performance and margins, but we saw a bigger outperformance on the growth side, on the other side of the downturn. That's the first thing. Second, they took a more active owner's mindset. And what we mean by that is they actually were more aggressive in terms of divesting businesses as well as acquiring businesses. In other words, every company looks at it and say, where are their natural owners and what should they be really focused on? They use this opportunity to sharpen and focus their business strategy and the portfolio. And the third thing we would say is they created more flexibility. They created more operational flexibility as in lowering the break-even point, but they also created more financial flexibility in terms of a stronger and much stronger balance sheet that they actually created. So those were purposeful actions. None of them have to do with slash or burn. Any one of them you could look at and say is just great leadership and sound business practice.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I really found interesting in the paper is that you didn't take a one-size-fits-all mentality. You basically acknowledge that everybody, you know, all these companies are in a different place, right? And there are cyclical companies that are going to be more impacted than non-cyclical companies. And even the cyclical companies are not going to be impacted necessarily the same way their industries were in past cycles. And so therefore, these distinctions that you've put together really, I think, are very helpful for companies to think through, you know, where they are in it. You know, and it's a sort of a checklist, I think, in a very common sense approach, because you don't want to just hunker down and then find yourself in a weakened condition just because that's what happened last time. And so you're really advocating a rethink to going into this and take advantage early on in the cycle of all these characteristics that which are truly different than last time. Maybe you can, you know, say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So look, I think the message is in a way, you know what position you're in as we head into this uncertainty is almost a core message, right? And part of that, by the way, another message I'd love to share is we often see that companies can really enhance how they're thinking about FP&A and forward scenario planning, and we think there's a lot there, right? So if you can pull together a robust picture of what your forecasts look going forward, you can really understand which company am I? Am I poised? Am I in a position of strength, and therefore should really think offensively as we head into this this period and look more to things, as Asutosh mentioned, like M&A, for example, where we think there's an enormous opportunity? Or am I going to be in a situation where I'm really challenged? And if you could be challenged in 3, 4, 5, 6 quarters, I think our message there is to get way ahead of the game. And back to the resilience research that we shared, going back to the last crisis, the message there was early and bold action left those players in the best situation. And so I think it really gets at what you're saying, which is know what position you're in, and then maximize your set of cards you happen to have heading into the crisis.
Yeah, but don't do so willy-nilly. One of the things that we're seeing as an example coming out of the recession here from COVID is that certain industries benefited, certain industries did not. Those that could serve in home and serve remotely benefited, but they went whole hog in saying the world's changed and is permanent. Now these companies are stuck with overinvestment in space. For instance, Amazon finds itself with way too much distribution space. Inventories are going crazy. So I think what I liked about the way you approached it is to say, look, every business is different. You've got to think through what's going to happen. You act early, but you don't act blindly through this. Is that fair?
Absolutely. In fact, the description is that there is a timeless set of principles, but each company applies those principles to its own situation is actually different, right? I think John mentioned the 4 archetypes. So first you have to start by asking which archetype are you in? Then you've got to ask yourself, what is your starting position across the 6 dimensions that we just talked about, right? How good are you, from a financial standpoint? From an operational standpoint, everyone is talking about supply chain, right? What does that look like? How much capacity do you have? Where do you stand on digital and technology? I've heard from a lot of CEOs who talked about investments that they've made in digital and technology, but have not seen the corresponding benefits in productivity or top line revenue growth, right? But what is the foundation that you're starting with? And similarly, brand, reputation, business model, and organization. And there is one other key word that we would add, that John and I would add to the conversation, which is granularity. Even for the same institution, you might have pockets that you are very different, that are much more growth oriented. Back to your point, Steve, different sectors of the economy are actually operating at very, very different points at this points in time. So especially for companies that either have customers or have operations that serve different end markets, you need to take a very granular view and come back and think about how you can actually pivot some of your resources, some of your focus into the markets. You still have at this point in time certain markets that are growing at high double digits, and will continue to do so. So how do you make sure you recognize that and treat that differently from something which has got, let's say, long and continuous and steady long-term growth potential, but might be much slower in the short to midterm? So those are 2 very different, even with the same starting position, those are 2 very different outlooks, and therefore you've got to think about those in a much more granular way.
Yeah, you've described the 4 archetypes, and we covered them a little earlier: poised to thrive, resolve to reform, pivot to profit, and then fight to survive. But this requires that companies are honest with themselves, right? Are really objective about their business, where they fit in their industry, where they fit, and what kind of cycle we're going into. Because if there really should be identifying themselves as fight to survive, well, then you do need to hunker down. You do need to have cash and all of that, and you can't just go willy-nilly and go crazy in M&A. But if the company is in a poised to thrive, as you're saying, then this whole notion of early and bold M&A and some of these other strategies that you've raised make more sense. So this honesty, this truly objective analytical honesty is really, I think, the starting point.
I'm glad you raised that, and I'd add, it's not only honesty, but I think organization. So and Asutosh and I and this team that has been developing this work, we see this all the time, that it is essential to look in the mirror, right? And really understand, what archetype am I? And is that answer based in facts and data versus intuition, right? Because it's a tricky environment. And one thing that I would say is that when I reflect on the companies that we see that are doing really well in this challenged environment versus some others that are more struggling, I think there's a mindset that people do not approach this as BAU, i.e. business as usual, right? So typically there's a bit of a special effort that is stood up to do, Steve, exactly what you were suggesting, which is how do we look at the facts quickly in a dispassionate way and get a sense for which archetype we are with data? And then how do we organize sort of a nerve center or a bit of a war room that is going to constantly monitor these changing economic conditions and spearhead our response, be it defensive or offensive?
Yeah, and maybe get some outside advice, right? That's part of it. But I think, as I dial back the clock to 2008, this whole notion of really bold M&A, I think of retail as an industry, and what were there? About 200 retail bankruptcies during that period of time. So bold M&A is not only just buying; it could be saying, okay, let's, we're a weak player, we're going into a down cycle, we're not well positioned. We should be thinking about proactively taking advantage of the situation, but acting fast. All the things you talked about that could be interpreted as only, the acquirer, but you should also be thinking about the opposite, as potentially doing something different with your own capital structure, or even selling the company.
That's exactly right, Steve. And therefore, I think we see this as a point of, when we talk to CEOs and CFOs and business leaders, our discussion tends to be a lot around how do you use this moment to be purposeful and accelerate. This is your idea about offense versus defense. You obviously have to be prudent around taking a set of actions. And of course, we never suggest you not do that. But I think just being prudent enough, but forgetting, I think, to be bolder and more purposeful in terms of how you want to accelerate, in terms of how you raise your ambition through this. And more importantly, I think John used the word organization a few minutes ago. I think our sense is we are not constrained for business leaders today are not constrained for capital. They're not constrained for opportunities. They're really constrained by this talent, this organization, this ability to move at pace to be able to get things done. In our conversation, CEOs are saying, hey, we've just went through this, this long period of a pandemic. Some of our people are exhausted. They're just coming back. And how do we brace ourselves to be able to lead through this next chapter? And I think they're right on that front, right? I think most institutions and most people in society in general has actually been through a lot over the last pandemic that people thought would last 6 weeks. We're now 2.5 years and it's still running. So there's some real impact just because of that. But at the same time, the moment of uncertainty is here. And I think if it is very hard from the standpoint of everything we see, it's very hard to go back and look at past economic cycles to predict an economic scenario. But the thing that is clear is you can borrow from timeless leadership principles to be able to establish and say, how can you lead your institution? And one of the things, at least in our conversations, our kind of our final message would be, there is no better time to be a CEO. What you do in today's environment will matter a lot more than what you did, say, a few years ago.
Well, I'm gonna quote you on that, Asutosh. The moment of uncertainty is here. It's arrived. And therefore what you should do. Well, we just scratched the surface on this paper this new paper from McKinsey Company. Hopefully it's whetted everybody's appetite. Where can our listeners go to find the full paper and read it in its entirety?
We have this published on McKinsey.com, Steve. It's been prominently featured, and we are also happy to make it available at other outlets.
Yeah, that's great. So they can go to your website, McKinsey.com. Asutosh, John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader or two to provide insights into the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, environmental social governance, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues. I know they're going to want to listen to it too. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.